that we've gone through in terms of the negotiations over the GERD, I think there is plenty of reason to think that ultimately, a compromise and a deal will be the outcome.
Taking the points you made earlier about the political importance of this for Abiy Ahmed, perhaps we could turn to domestic politics in Ethiopia, around both the effects of the pandemic in terms of the well-being of Ethiopian people, but also its political repercussions. And the most obvious political repercussion, I suppose, has been the decision of the government to postpone the national elections due in August. And these were meant to be perhaps the most consequential elections in Ethiopia, certainly for 2 decades, perhaps longer, in which Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed was due to launch a new party and perhaps a new form of politics in the country. So how has that decision gone down to postpone the elections? And what are the discussions about preparing a new date for the elections and the various balance of political forces on the scene there?
Yeah, so it's had some very, very serious consequences, as you've outlined, in terms of the election delay, and if that's a secondary impact of COVID-19, it's actually the secondary impact of that election delay which is threatening to be the biggest problem here. What I mean is that there's not that many political actors in Ethiopia, if any, that I'm aware of, who came straight out and said, no, you can't do that. We must Burundi style, we must plow ahead with the election regardless of this pandemic. Instead, people looked at the situation, most said, yeah, we understand, now's not a great time to be preparing, especially for such a momentous election. The issue then became, that means that the election is not going to occur before the government's term expires, and my understanding is that's on the 5th of October. So then the question is, well, what is the governing, what is the authority, the legal authority of the government, or any government, subsequent to October the 5th? The Constitution says governments must only be in power through election. So what do we do? And it's that process and issues related to deciding the new electoral schedule that are causing problems. And this really gets to the heart of Ethiopia's sort of transitional dilemma quite quickly. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed obviously came in as a breath of fresh air, reformist. He's got rid of the ruling coalition, the PRDF. He's replaced it with a Prosperity Party. Now, what Prosperity Party and the incumbent have done is that they have put this decision, this constitutional dilemma, put it to the constitutional interpretation process, which is the upper house of parliament. The problem is that upper house of parliament is full of the old members of the regime, which the protests were against, and essentially which Abiy's reforms have come in to replace. So we're really looking at this problem of a hybrid transition. The Prime Minister and his allies are talking about, let's abide by the constitutional processes, rule of law, democratic institutions, etc. The issue is that those democratic institutions have very, very little political legitimacy in Ethiopia, because the elections that have been postponed were supposed to in some ways sort of clear out the old regime and then enter a new era of democracy, as you were describing. So it's a very tricky situation. Of course, we don't know. We can't know for sure what the upper house of parliament is going to say when they rule about how they should be handled. But there is a widespread assumption that they will give legal authority for the incumbent to continue in power. And of course, when we have the incumbent and the institutions it controls extending its term for a certain amount of period, that is a huge red flag, or at least a huge opportunity for Ethiopia's political opposition, which is relatively emboldened these days. So they are saying, you're moving into an extra constitutional period. This government you're struggling for legitimacy anyway. You're going to move into an area where you have even less legitimacy. Therefore, you have to buy us into the process. The only way this is going to work is with some kind of broad-based inclusive settlement. Various ideas, interim government, caretaker government, transitional government, some sort of formal consultative role for the opposition, various ideas being chucked around. But the point is, this has to be broad-based and inclusive. We cannot have the incumbent calling all the shots here. And of course, the ultimate concern is the elections itself. The opposition want to be able to influence the decision-making surrounding the election. When is it going to be? It's going to be sometime next year, probably, but when is it going to be? What sort of opportunity are they going to be given to campaign? And can they get commitments from the incumbent to give the, to maximise the space for the opposition, as was promised, to make this a free and fair election, and one where people accept the result and they move on from that. So it really has led to some quite problematically, sort of snowballing downstream effects that the pandemic has.
So for the opposition, pushing this idea of some sort of interim power-sharing government after this crunch date you're talking about in October would be a very good option, presumably, because it would bring them in right to the heart of government. It would give them a much more say-so over how the elections are organised, presumably, and they could then voice their concerns about accountability and the fairness of those elections directly to the government. I guess on the government side, that is the incumbent, Abiy Ahmed, and the old ruling party that's in situ at the moment. That would be a difficult ask. How likely do you think there is to be some sort of power-sharing arrangement after October in Ethiopia?
Well, the signs are so far that it doesn't look particularly likely. I mean, I'm forecasting here.
Yeah.
I can't be sure, but it does look like the constitutional interpretation process will probably say the incumbent stays in office. I imagine that the Prime Minister and his allies in the ruling party, they will be they will want to reach out to the opposition to some extent, and have sort of regular consultations with the opposition. And I think really we get into the weeds there. Yep. It's a question of what sort of role does the opposition have? Like, what happens if they say they don't like a government decision? I mean, is the government going to give them any kind of veto over critical decision making related to the election? That would be obviously something that the opposition would be calling for, but maybe the government won't go that far. And then there's also the issues about who will represent the opposition, and and how will we formalise any sort of consultative role that they may be given. So I find it quite likely that the opposition will be given, there will be some sort of regular interaction with the opposition, but I think the crunch could come that actually in reality how meaningful that is, or what is the perception of how meaningful it is from the opposition. And I think sort of one of the things that you were pushing at there is, of course, we have a very fractious political environment in Ethiopia. There's opposition parties and opposition leaders who are at loggerheads with the Prime Minister and with the incumbent. Major rifts in the opposition landscape itself, between those who back multinational ethnic federalism and those who think that the federal system is driving Ethiopians apart from each other, interregional tensions and all the rest of it. So there's very severe tensions within the opposition. So it's a question of, can the opposition get itself organised, present a sort of cohesive front, and then negotiate some sort of acceptable bargain with the government? Or instead is this just going to be a sort of another power struggle, and one in which, quite frankly, it looks like the incumbent holds quite a lot of the cards at the moment. And then, of course, if the incumbent does just kind of drive home that advantage, how is the opposition going to react? Are we going to see potentially some sort of form of return to street protests in the future?
Because a lot of it is at stake for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. I mean, he had got this great reputation internationally, within the region, and initially at home, for being this great reformer, for bringing back dissidents from abroad, for opening the political and the media space in Ethiopia. I suppose there's a risk if he pushes his advantage as incumbent too far, he loses all that kudos, and you kind of get a back to the old default position, and there's a risk of that, is there?
Yes, in some ways. I mean, yes. I mean, certainly. So the issue is this a totally open democratic transition where the whole thing is just thrown open, and any kind of political actor, any kind of political entrepreneur, has the chance to make a name for themselves and to grab some formal power, or instead is this a transition which is guided and guarded by the new great democratic prime minister? I mean, at the moment, it's been much more the latter, right? And instead, the opposition is still on the sidelines, complaining about harassment, complaining about shutout, and the powers that be are telling everyone, don't worry, we've got this. We're steering the country into a more democratic space where we will have the rule of law and constitutional government. We will also modernize the economy, just bear with us, and you shouldn't pay too much heed to some of those opposition characters. They are essentially they are just spoilers. So there is definitely that tension. What would it mean to throw this thing open democratically? And I think at the moment, the concern is that we are shifting, tilting a little bit more towards the problem of the prime minister, who's by far the most powerful political figure in the country, sure, and the incumbent, which obviously has a lot of power as well. There is a concern that they are leaning on that power too much, shutting out the opposition too much, and therefore we might be repeating the kind of cycle of political tension that we've seen in the past in Ethiopia. That's not to say that there's an obvious and easy alternative path, but there is certainly kind of genuine and fairly kind of widespread concern that this moment of pluralism is not necessarily going to arrive because of the continuing control that the incumbent is exerting.
Thanks, William. To round up, I'd like to ask you really about the conditions in the country at the moment, how the government, how the public health system is dealing with the pandemic. Because in terms of results and tests in the rest of the continent, Ethiopia seems to have had a fairly low rate of infection and fatalities from the coronavirus pandemic, and certainly compared to Europe or Asia, much, much lower. What's been the performance so far, and what are people's feelings about the pandemic and its threats to their lives and livelihoods?
Well, there's a great deal of uncertainty here, as elsewhere. Both from my perspective, but also I think from a lot of people. Yes, you're right about the low infection rates. They've increased a bit, but so has testing increased. There isn't any sign of there isn't sort of substantive reports of excessive mortality, suggesting that we may have a sort of a hidden crisis. But at the same time, whilst the government may have acted fairly efficiently in some regards, so maybe the quarantine procedures for arrivals, the quite early enactment of a state of emergency with some stringent regulations, whilst the government's acted efficiently, maybe arguably in that regard. Also, if you're around Addis and elsewhere in Ethiopia, there isn't much sign of this so-called social distancing. People aren't necessarily adhering to the regulations, and there's just an imperative for people to get on with their daily lives because they have to earn their daily bread as well. So it's a very mixed picture. And I think, in keeping with sort of dynamics elsewhere, obviously the warnings have been there, the concerns are there, the regulations are out, the face masks are out, the signs are out, and then the crisis hasn't really hit home yet. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for the government to keep, getting people to adhere more and more to the regulations, and instead we might find people just being more and more inclined to go about their business. So it's a very uncertain story. I certainly don't feel in any kind of authoritative position to speak about exactly what's going on now, let alone the future trajectory. But we can obviously see some of these major downstream effects the politics that we've talked about. And then obviously Ethiopia as a country, as an economy and as a population, lots of vulnerability in terms of the economic circumstances.